Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and good afternoon to all of you. 25 years ago, we thought the Cold War had come to an end. Europe was supposed to be united, whole, and free. Old confrontations were supposed to have been resolved. Indeed, just 4 years ago, at the OSCE summit in Astana, in Kazakhstan, heads of state and governments agreed to create a new Euro-Atlantic Eurasian security community. Yet, today, we see the drawing of new dividing lines, and we hear threats of aggression. There is armed conflict in the Ukraine and dangerous warning signs elsewhere, including in the Baltic states. The rule of law has been violated, and the rules of war are unclear. 100 years after the outbreak of the First World War, Europe again, many say, stands at the abyss. Why has the dream of a European security community turned into a nightmare? How can aggression be stopped? How can the current crisis be de-escalated? Is there indeed a real danger of war? And what steps can be taken to promote peace? To discuss Europe's new security environment, I am delighted to have with us today the President of Estonia, His Excellency Toomas Hendrik Ilves. The President is one of Europe's most eloquent and high-profile statesmen, having been Foreign Minister twice and President since the year 2006. He has also been a member of both the Estonian and the European Parliaments. He is a very well-known analyst, dating back to his time at Radio Free Europe in the 1980s, and more recently through his prolific writings. The President is a strong promoter of education and information technology, and is one of the pioneers of the digital revolution in Estonia. Due to its history and geography, Estonia has had, at times, a troubled relationship with its neighbor, Russia. Is this now a part of a broader, troubled security reality in Europe? So, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss the recent geopolitical developments in Europe and their impact on international peace and security, please join me in welcoming President Ilves. Mr. President, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to discuss all these wonderful things. Well, what can I say? In the past 7 months, the entire security environment in Europe has changed, and these are unprecedented developments that we have not seen since World War II. I think anyone from my part of the world rejoiced in the Annus Mirabilis of 1989 when we saw peace, freedom, democracy, human rights flower with the collapse of the wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union for at least Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who had been working for it. And this year, I have been going to these various events in Poland and the Czech Republic celebrating the Annus Mirabilis, but at the same time, it's turning into an Annus Horribilis. It's for 2014, 25 years after the war. It's the year that the international order as we've known it since the Cold War just basically collapsed. And I would argue that it even goes far further back than the Cold War, in which we did have at least a semblance of rule-based behavior that we don't have today. And that rule-based behavior goes back to 1945 with the UN Charter over there, or actually in San Francisco, when the Charter was adopted. It declared all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Okay, well, we throw that out. Then we have the Helsinki Final Act, which is more of a sort of a thing of the North, in which all transatlantic countries agreed not to use force to change borders or to challenge the political independence of any state. States agreed to regard one another's frontiers inviolable, to refrain from making each other's territory the object of military occupation, and added then, no such occupation or acquisition would be recognized as legal. And then we had the 1990 Charter of Paris for New Europe. I was there. They didn't let us Estonians in because Mikhail Gorbachev said no, they can't get in, but at least the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs and Slovaks were there, which agreed from Vancouver to Vladivostok that to, quote, fully recognize the freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. Now, we've seen the annexation of Crimea, we've seen the invasion of eastern Ukraine by countries that are signatories to these fundamental security agreements that form the basis of the security architecture of Europe today, or should. And so here we are. None of the rules apply, at least in security. The Ukrainian crisis, I would argue, is not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is not solely a European issue, because if instead of agreements and laws and conventions, raw, brutal force applies in international relations, if changing state borders by force will become an accepted norm, then the stability of the whole world is threatened. So, the question is, how do we proceed? I would argue the international community cannot leave Crimea in the situation it is now. We all have, in fact, agreed or everyone in the CSE or the OSCE, as it is now, have agreed that no such annexations or changes in borders would be accepted as legal or recognized. We cannot accept the creation of foreign conflicts as a tool of geopolitical ends. Referenda that are held with a 2-week announcement cannot be accepted as representing anything, especially when they take into place, when they are held in the presence of foreign military. And so, again, we see all the rules broken, more sort of understood rules about how things are done. And when we see the justification for it, actually, we saw the justification for it already in 2008, when I think the first alarm bells went off and nobody really noticed and everyone pressed the snooze button, was when we saw the justification for the post hoc justification for the invasion of Georgia was that the Georgians wanted to join NATO. This was both those, those justifications came from President Medvedev at the time and also by Prime Minister Putin some 6 months after the August 2008 war. So clearly, even then, we knew that the Paris Charter, which had been signed by Russia, or which had been signed by the Soviet Union, but Russia took over all the legal obligations as the legal successor state, that then it didn't apply. But what did Europe do? It said, oh no, let's not pay attention, let's not really worry about it, it'll go away. And Well, it didn't go away. 6 years after, we see what we have seen in the past 5 months. And so this leads, I would argue, that we have to start reconsidering the role of the United Nations. Because how is it that one of the fundamental goals of the United Nations, which is global peace and security, be advanced when international agreements are ignored, have no weight, when state borders are changed or annexed through force? So that, that which leads us to think about the UN and the Security Council, which has been paralyzed, that has been manipulated, where multiple crises have been created. And so we have to really look toward the Security Council, because the Security Council members carry enormous responsibility in maintaining order in the world. And we see permanent members using the veto, their veto to, or abuse the veto to circumvent the principles of the UN Charter. Again, what do we do? So, and then of course there are deeper things which are not forbidden by law. We thought they'd just received an answer received the definitive answer on May 8th, 1945, which is the end of World War II. That gave the definitive military answer to the concept of annexation of territory because of compatriots living abroad. If you recall, in 1938, the annexation of Sudetenland by Nazi Germany, saying we have Germans living there, so we're going to take it over. But this is precisely the completely unacceptable, yet nonetheless used argument in the case of Crimea. So we're not doing very well. Now, if we think more broadly about where this goes, if you have a Europe that has enjoyed 25 years of the peace dividend, as President George Bush I called it, which has led to Europe spending much less money on defense, on security, and has also enabled Europe, including my country, to do quite a bit in keeping the UN going and giving foreign aid. Today, 20% of the UN budget comes from the United States, 40% comes to the European Union, and then a few other countries like Japan contribute also considerably. If now we lose the peace dividend and we have to start spending much more money on things that we thought we would not have to spend money on, such as defense, then I think this will ripple through the international community, the aid-receiving community, the developing world, because ultimately, what does a country do when its own security is threatened? You go back to your basic Maslowian fundamental needs. Your security is far more important than proceeding on giving aid. So this, I think, will have, unless we come up with a solution to what we have right now, we will see defense expenditure go up. We will see the re-securitization of foreign policy in Europe. That's all a future we probably wouldn't want. Estonia is one of the 3 countries in Europe that spends 2% of GDP on defense, meeting our NATO obligations. Next year, we'll see Poland and France up there. Other countries have decided to spend more money on defense as well. So that means that, that's what comes first for a country, and that means that other things will be cut. And I bet one of the first things that'll be cut will be all the kind of what seems extraneous, such as development aid. So I think that we're in a new world. Another example is not only just foreign aid money, but my country has having a considerable amount of security empathy through the years. We have been all over contributing peacekeeping troops to Macedonia, to Lebanon. We just finished a fairly large mission in the Central African Republic. We're in Mali. I don't see countries like mine being very active in doing peacekeeping missions far, far away from our country when, in fact, the security situation in our immediate area has dramatically changed. And I think there are many other countries that are like that in Europe. There is a process, there's a rethink going through on what we're doing, what is the situation, and that we cannot take for granted anymore that the fundamental principles of peace and security since 1945 or the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, that they no longer apply. So in answer to your question, we are not in a new Cold War, because during even the Cold War, there were certain agreements that held and held fast, at least in Europe, and no longer do. And I guess the only analogous period I can find is the pre-Cold War period. It began in 1945 and perhaps ended in 1948-49, when the West didn't quite understand what was going on when its erstwhile ally, Stalin, and Stalin's Soviet Union started behaving in ways that were really unpredictable. And it was ultimately a labor organizer, Labor Party Foreign Minister Bevin, who came up with the idea of the United States and, at that time, Western Europe should have a collective security arrangement. And then we got the North Atlantic Treaty in 1948, followed by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which gave it teeth. Yeah, we saw the Marshall Aid Program, and also Europe at that time also looking not only at the military side, but at the economic and social side, created the Coal and Steel Community, which then became the EEC, which then became the European Union. But those are all responses to a dramatically changed security situation after World War II. And I think we're basically in 1946, trying to figure out what we're going to do. But we will have to figure something out, and it's all going to be a pain. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much for an extraordinarily interesting intervention, and also admirably pointed and short. I think it was the most pointed and the shortest we've had from this podium this season.
I can go on.
And I know, and we will give you opportunity to do it. So, and I think also what we saw and heard here is not extraordinary words. We also listened to an extraordinary man, and I think we should use the opportunity to have a dialogue with him on the basis of his intervention. I think a couple of the cores of your message to us is that we have, which I think most of us are aware of, that we have a paralysis of many of the pressing issues of international peace and security in the Security Council. But I also think when you paired this with another dimension, namely that the new security challenges which we are facing in many places of the world, but now also in Europe, will move money away from what was the peace dividend, as you phrased it, which has been the part of the financial basis which has been provided to international institutions of development, but also peace and security, such as the institution across the street. And what I read between the lines there is that what you fear is that this would have a dramatic impact on the financial situation of these institutions, at the same time as there are rising challenges for these institutions, simply because defense and self-defense will rise so much higher on the priority of the political systems. And I'm sure that,
okay.
Go ahead.
But also, simply, I mean, which countries that are currently very heavily involved in doing peacekeeping operations, policing operations, won't be that willing to send their own troops?
Which adds to the gloomy picture you already have painted. Let me, before I open the floor, there in the lingo of international diplomacy and international affairs, there are now two very fashionable buzzwords. And one is the notion of Russia world, which I would ask you to elaborate a bit on, but just as an intro, which is a concept which you will find in many publications and on the internet now. That is that that there is a perception, both amongst some in Russia and outside Russia, that there is an ambition here to reach out, if I may use that phrase, to a Russia world which is composed of a big chunk of the Ukraine, all of Belarus, parts of the Baltic states, maybe northern Kazakhstan, etc. And that this is an ambition. I'm not taking a stand on this. I'm just asking a question on the basis of what you can find. This is proliferating throughout the internet. And the second buzzword is hybrid warfare. So where the perception among some is that there is a new political ambition here, but there's also a new way of conducting warfare, which constitutes new realities, particularly in Europe, but also touches on broader issues of international peace and security. So I would like, before I open the floor, I'm sure there are many questions to you and views which will be presented. Could you say a few words about this concept of Russia world and the concept of hybrid warfare, and how what the implications for defense this has?
Well, nothing really new. I mean, it goes back to Ubi Romani, ibi Roma. Where there is a Roman, there is Rome. So that's over 2,000 years old. It's sort of more modern versions. Well, I mentioned them. The annexation of the Sudetenland and the Anschluss of Österreich or Austria. I once found a book of German military maps, and it had a map around my country. And it says Grenze des Deutsches Kultureinflusszone, or the border of the German influence zone. It was a World War II map. It was printed March 31st, 1941. Streng Geheimnis. I mean, this is an approach that I think puts a lot of places in danger, including Brighton Beach, and so. I don't think it's a very worthwhile approach to. I mean, it's not exactly a really smart form of foreign policy, which also, I mean, it actually refers to. I mean, it has at its basis a rather anti-liberal, anti-democratic look at the world. That says that I mean, it's almost as if you're taking Samuel Huntington and not as a descriptive approach, but rather as a prescriptive approach. That okay, you define at the outset, we are a distinct civilization. We don't like homosexuals. Freedom of speech is really not part of our culture. Decadent liberal democracies in Europe are tired and failed, whereas we are young and robust, which is actually an argument you heard in the 1920s and 30s from the NSDAP. And I would say you might want to look at the real sources of it in Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political, a forgotten or not very well-known German but very smart political scientist who was the sort of chief ideologue of Nazi Germany, which is now, and he's also the idol of Alexander Dugin in Russia today, which basically is an anti-liberal democracy position. The other historical roots of it, I would say, is in Tsar Nicholas I, autocracy, orthodoxy, and Derzhava, or great statehood, which we see repeatedly over and over again. I saw this in 1993, 94 in Serbia, but that wasn't really that big a country. But at that time, I remember thinking, I hope that Russia never undergoes a Milosevization of what we saw, of the kind we saw in Serbia, where you have Orthodox priests blessing with holy water, Kalashnikovs and tanks, which we do see now. And so there's amalgam of religion, chauvinistic nationalism, great statehood, and ethnicity, combined with autocracy and autocratic rule, is something we should fear, I would argue. Now, I mean, if you look, I mean, there's also another root of this is actually an essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn from about 1991, in which he argued that basically what is needed is a Slavic union consisting of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and the northern part of Kazakhstan. Already that was, I mean, from a CSE or Helsinki Final Act point of view, was a little scary. And now we see this being promoted more and more. Now, one of the big journalistic cliches that I unfortunately have to deal with all the time, almost every interview, is Narva next? Because first of all, it's alliterative, but secondly, we do have the city of Narva, which is largely Russian in Estonia. And there, well, I would say that while polls show that there is strong support for the annexation of Crimea, as soon as you ask the next question, well, do you want to be part of Russia? They go, no, 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 no. I mean, and this comes from the huge difference in standards of living between one side of the river and the other side of the river. If you contrast the Ukrainian situation, the average miner in Ukraine, Russian, and working in Donetsk gets 200 euros a month or $250 a month. The average miner in Estonia gets 2,000 euros a month. So it's not as if, and of course in Europe, if you're a resident of any EU member with, in the Schengen zone at least, you have free movement of labor and person anywhere in Europe. So if you join Russia, then I guess you get free movement of labor to Kamchatka or Tambov Oblast, but you don't really get it for, you don't get to come to Europe anymore. So I mean, there's not much of an incentive. And so when we look at the other side of the polls, then when asked, well, would you want to be part of Russia, then the support for that idea is infinitesimal. But nonetheless, we see a lot of that being said, and there are efforts trying to get things. I mean, there have been attempts that we've noticed and trying to sort of stir something up, but it's not working. And as I said, that idea renders all kinds of places, not only Brighton Beach, but Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic, London. There are a lot of places that, following that approach, would have some serious problems. On the other hand, we do find, interestingly enough, that we're getting a whole lot of people moving to Estonia from Russia because their liberal Democrats are being persecuted. So, if anyone's ever read Aksionov's Crimea Island, it's a great book on sort of the alternative that sort of describes what Estonia is to these people today. Of course, at the end of Crimea Island, pictures Crimea as an island, they get invaded by the Soviet Union. On the hybrid warfare, I mean, let's face it, we get, when there are certain rules of warfare that have been developed over time, no chemical weapons, people who, insignia troops are to be treated as prisoners of war and given certain rights. Basically, we're getting Hobbesian here. We're getting away from the rules, and we don't have to follow the agreements that we've had. It's just as much a part of the failure of the agreements that I mentioned earlier that we don't have troops with insignia. What do they become? Then they become terrorists, actually. Massive amount of disinformation. They're just new modes of warfare that have not been used before. Cyber attacks also were not the cyber attacks are now a domain of warfare, according to the U.S. military. The Department of Defense says the cyber is just important as a domain as land, air, and sea when it comes to warfare. Well, we see this proliferation and expansion of the domains of conflict, and that's where we are.
Thank you very much. Again, as you can see and hear, well informed, stringent and to the point. And I think you can expect answers to your questions the same way. May I open the floor? I see a hand first over there. Could you please state your name and affiliation when you take the floor, and you will be given a microphone.
Lawrence Moss from Hunter College. Defenders of Russia's actions, and to be clear, I'm not one of them, would point to Kosovo and the NATO intervention in Serbia to protect Kosovo. And I'm sure you don't share that view, Kosovo having declared independence and Estonia having been one of the first countries to recognize it. But how do you distinguish that situation? Didn't NATO tear up the rule book in going into Serbia?
It was a humanitarian intervention. I mean, they were killing Kosovars. So, I mean, they weren't killing anybody in Crimea, and the only people killing anybody in Lugansk and Slavyansk in the beginning, the only people being killed there were people who were pro-Ukrainian. So that's the difference, strictly.
Thank you. Then the gentleman on my right here.
Warren Hogue, International Peace Institute. Mr. President, you mentioned cyber warfare. Estonia in 2007 suffered a very large, politically motivated cyber attack on its institutions. Since then, I'm told Estonia has become a leader in cybersecurity. Can you expand a little bit on what kind of threat that still represents against your country and also the other Baltic countries?
Well, first of all, I don't say it has nothing to do with my country or the Baltic countries. I mean, except for the fact that perhaps as wired as Estonia is, it is perhaps more vulnerable. But I mean, it's a kind of vulnerability. It has nothing to do with distance. I mean, in the digital world, it can be anywhere and it come from any place. The kind of attack we had, which still exists in a lot of places, they're called DDoS, distributed disruptions of service through distributed attacks against single servers. They're usually done by the same people who do spams. They rent out their computers, and instead of sending spam out everywhere, they have these networks of controlled computers send this spam all to one place. And it's usually done in cooperation between, in our case, it's done between governments and mafia. I mean, because these botnets are mafia run and mafia owned. So it's a unique form of public-private partnership that we see. But that's not the big problem. I mean, that means you just sort of overload a server. And when cybersecurity is real issues have to do with the kinds of, I guess the shutdown of the Iranian centrifuges by a worm, the kind of things that if you see happening in say, the electrical system of your city, say someone makes turns all the lights red in Manhattan, or even more dangerously, someone turns all the lights green at the same time. There was actually a case of that in Los Angeles. I mean, the guys went to jail, but they were the people working on traffic light control, and they went on strike. And then they thought, well, maybe we'll disrupt a little traffic to make a point. Think of those kinds of events rather than just the kind of low-level distributed denial of service attacks that Estonia got. I mean, nothing was damaged. The one thing that could have been damaging was that they knocked out the equivalent of the 9/11 emergency number for a while, for about an hour. But we were fairly well prepared for it, and anyway, we did okay. But much more broadly, it has nothing to, the Baltic states, please, geographically, they're one place. When it comes to things like, sort of cyber attacks, there could just well be New Jersey. It's not the Baltic states. Well, that's something we have to deal with. NATO has its Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense in Tallinn. The EU has its Cybersecurity Center for personal data and for the Schengen area in Tallinn, and we, I guess, are the only country that actually has an MOU with the United States on cyber defense. So we do okay.
Thank you very much again. Then I will go to the lady on the right there. I saw the hand in the back there as well. You will get the opportunity in a little while.
Hi, Maureen Quinn from the International Peace Institute. Mr. President, I was wondering if you could share your perspective on the use of economic sanctions as a tool in this new security reality. I mean, economic sanctions have been used to a certain extent with regard to Crimea and Ukraine. So I'd appreciate your views on where would you see them, or their use being effective, any comments you might have. Thank you.
Well, not being an expert, but I would just say the time frames may not be completely synchronized, because the events that take place in Ukraine, I mean, there is very rapidly changing, whereas the effects of the sanctions tend to be rather long term. I mean, take place over a very long time. I mean, what you're doing is you're slowing down in an economy. Is that enough to stop and change actions? I don't know. It seems to have increased resolve, at least the economic sanctions. I think sanctioning individuals and keeping them out of the European Union and the United States probably is a little bit more effective, though probably far more effective is to have their wives, mistresses, and children kept out, though then again, that's legally a little difficult. But money laundering, I mean, if I were to do it, I would say use in a very tight way money laundering laws, because that money that is being generated through basically stripping the resources of the country and making a very limited number of people very rich, they don't want to keep it there. They want to keep it outside, so they usually don't do it legally. So money laundering laws, I think, are far more effective, and confiscation of people's stolen money is probably more effective. But again, the time frame, the difference in time frame is, I think, the real problem we face, because, I mean, say we keep up sanctions for 3 or 4 years, maybe they'll start to bite, but who knows where we'll be in 3 or 4 years.
Once again, thank you. And then there is a hand in the middle here.
There are a whole bunch of them there.
Mr. President, thank you very much for excellent presentation. My name is S.V. Karmakar. I'm from International Committee for Peace and Reconciliation. My question directly to Crimea. As far as you understand, as I know, maybe rightly or wrongly, Crimea was given to Ukraine without consulting the wishes of the people. And this time, Putin gave them an opportunity. By plebiscite, they joined Russia. That is what we see from outside world. What is your comment?
Well, as I said here, you don't organize plebiscites 2 weeks in advance under the presence of foreign military troops. It's just not legitimate. So I just consider an illegitimate so-called referendum. I mean, we in Estonia know well when you have an election that has no legitimate basis, held under Soviet occupation with the presence of foreign troops, where the results are 99% in favor of committing suicide, giving up your country, and joining the Soviet Union, which happened in our country in 1940. I mean, there's no reason to believe in any of that stuff. And looking at the human rights violations going on right now with the persecution of the Tatars, then basically what's happened is that Crimea is now under full authoritarian and rather nasty foreign rule.
I saw a few other hands. There's one at the very back there, the lady. We got them all.
Yes, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'm Kate Hunt. I'm the UN representative for CARE International, which is an international aid organization. But I wanted to speak sort of in my former capacity as an NPR correspondent that covered the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I actually covered some of the difficult moments you're referring to from 91 to 94. And with respect to...
Can you move the microphone a little closer to your lips? Thank you.
With respect to your comment on the Russian population in Narva, it was very heartening to hear that they have the views they have. But it has been so disconcerting to see the suggestibility of the Russian population and the susceptibility to the disinformation that has been so powerful over the last few months, something we saw 25 years ago and thought the new generation of Russians might not respond in similar ways. Given your background and your analysis, would you speculate for us a little bit how you see the public opinion in Russia moving over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I mean, Russia is slowly moving, or not so slowly moving, towards a society of information, of an information monopoly. So there, aside from TV dodge, which is not possible, I mean, which very few see, there is no really alternative picture of anything. We used to have Radio Free Europe. I used to work there. I mean, then people listen to shortwave radios. No one has a shortwave radio anymore. The sort of a small group of people actually look for news on the internet, but even that it seems to be, it's moving towards restrictions on the internet, and you see restrictions. I mean, anyone, I guess, who has more than 3,000 followers on a blog has to register. So that, so you end up with actually a sort of a monopoly on truth and a very limited set of views that are freely available, and alternative views are not. And in that environment, I guess we see what's happening. It's far more slick than it ever was in the sort of old Soviet days when it was fairly primitive. I mean, whereas I think in terms of production values and the use of all kinds of photoshopping and other things that we see these days, that you can present an alternative truth. I mean, I think what we see going on in Russia is summed up in the movie Wagging the Dog, where you do create a false reality, and that's what I mean. How that's going to change, I don't know. I mean, people in North Korea think that they're living real well too, so because they're cut off from alternative sources of information.
Thank you. Then we will go here in the front.
That woman is getting frantic over there.
Where is she?
In the short, right by.
Rami Sroor from International Peace Institute. Mr. President, during your speech, you reaffirmed your commitment to the 2% GDP contribution to NATO. I was wondering if you could tell us whether Estonia is envisioning a situation in which it might up its contribution over the next months, given the geographic location and the current situation, and secondly, whether you would like to see any of the other fellow NATO members commit or make a firmer commitment to the 2% gap. Thank you.
Well, I mean, look, I think we're in an untenable situation in which the United States, which represents 1/3 of the population of NATO, if you take all the NATO countries together, it's about 900 million, 300 million in the US. It provides 75% of the budget for NATO. And we look at countries that, we have countries that spend, even frontline countries, that is to say bordering Russia, that spend 0.77% of GDP or 0.97% of GDP. I mean, we're kind of waiting for everyone else to do their share for a change, because we do it. I mean, we're a perverse country, I have to admit, because we actually believe in doing the things that you sign up to. So not only do we do 2%, but we were the only country during the economic crisis that did 2%, that followed the Maastricht rules on having under 3% of deficit spending, under 60% of GDP, and we borrowed, our indebtedness was lower. So, I mean, maybe we're just peasants in that we tend to stick to agreements, but small countries do tend to stick to agreements a little better because as Thucydides said, the strong will do what they will, and the weak do what they can.
Can you please raise your hands a little bit high, because sometimes I cannot see it.
A woman back there who's been trying for a long time.
Can we go to yourself, madam?
Yes, it's Rhonda Haubin, and I have a blog at Die Tageszeitung website, TATS, and I have two questions, actually. One, I guess the question has to do with, you mentioned that there's a media warfare going on, and I guess the question I have is about that, because if you go back to what happened in Ukraine with the coup, the Svoboda Party signed it, the Ban Ki-moon signed an agreement, and it was broken by people who attacked essentially a peaceful resolution. And Europe essentially accepted that activity. And so there's another narrative of some of what you've presented. And I guess the question I have is do you see any way that there can be an openness to considering what is other narratives that look at what the situation, look at some of the details and discuss them, instead of saying we need more military activity to go on. And just looking at other things, there was Libya, and what happened with Libya, there was Iraq, and what happened with Iraq. So I think it's a much more complex situation than we're discussing. But there's another aspect of what you're involved in, and that is, I thought, the coalition about the internet. And there, I thought you talking about freedom of expression, and I thought your country does have a very fine record of introducing the internet and spreading it in your country. And so I'm wondering if there's anything to be learned from the internet activity of people trying to find a way to talk to each other versus the effort of having somehow more military activity that will make the world a much more hostile place. Thank you.
Well, to answer the first part of the question, the alternative narrative is that Ukraine was run by fascists. The two hardcore right-wing candidates that could be remotely called fascists in Ukraine, neither one garnered even 1% in the presidential elections, but the talk about Ukrainian fascists continues. So that kind of is hard to take an alternative narrative seriously, just as the narrative that it was actually a Ukrainian fighter that shot down MH17. All of these things add up. That basically means that it's very hard to take seriously anything that comes from the alternative narrative, because it tends to be sort of, I don't want to use any barnyard epithets here, but it's not really very serious. Clearly, none of us are really interested in ultimately, from the point of a country, spending money on defense is much rather spend on all kinds of other things. But if you look at the massive increase in military activity in our region, or even all over the world by Russia today, with backfire bombers all over the place, doing training missions, bombing Sweden, just 2-3 days ago, massive incursion into the sort of water, the Baltic Sea, where between Skåne and southern Sweden and Denmark. Massive exercises that are performed in violation of the Vienna Agreement on having observers, practicing in Zapad 2011, using a tactical nuclear weapon on Warsaw, the huge exercises done last year, practicing the invasion of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. What are you supposed to do to that? You say, oh, that's nice. So we have to spend money on defense, and we have to think much more about security. We would much rather go back to peace, love, and Woodstock, but the problem is that it's not there. And so any rational, reasonable person, when they see their security environment changing, does something, and that's where it is. Even my position, for example, on the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, which is used in which some countries in NATO say, well, that means we can't put any troops into the new members, is that they forget to read the line, they forget to read the document, which has this one sentence. In the current and foreseeable security environment, unquote, there will be no permanent positioning of troops in the new member states, and so forth. The current and foreseeable security environment in 1997, when Boris Yeltsin still had 2.5 years to go, or a year and a half to go, sorry, right? Was very different, and no one really did see a threat at the time. But we are now in a completely different security environment. As I said, on the sort of new technology side, the problem is that, Estonia, we were until last year, when Iceland crept ahead of us, we didn't fall back. Number one in Freedom House's ranking of internet freedom. Now we're number 2. U.S. is number 3, Germany's number 4. But that means our people can read everything and read whatever they want. But other countries restrict access to the internet. And so here, it's not helping those other countries restrict access to the internet, and where blogs are banned and bloggers are jailed, be it in Russia or be it in Azerbaijan, that, it's not moving in a positive direction there.
I'm seeing many hands now being lifted, and I think we have time for me to give the floor to all of you, but I think I will start on the right-hand side there, and then move across the room again.
Mr. President, my name is Dennis Fredo. I'm with the Lutheran World Federation. I wanted to ask you to elaborate. I think earlier you talked about, of course, in light of recent events, there's a lack of compliance with international agreements and the international rules of behavior. And you suggested, I believe, that we should reconsider the role of the United Nations. And I'm wondering how you think that ought to proceed in a formal sense.
Well, I specifically think that the UN Security Council has failed to actually do what it's supposed to do. How to formally proceed, I don't know how to formally proceed, but the key issue is that if an institution is dysfunctional, then you have to figure out what makes it dysfunctional. Clearly, the use of the veto to prevent resolution of conflicts, which we saw in Syria and now we're seeing with Ukraine, are things that that perhaps ought to be looked over again. That's all. I don't do much with the UN.
Thank you. Can I ask you to lift your hands again? Then there is a gentleman at the very back.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm Omar Al-Okta with the International Peace Institute. I have 2 very brief questions. The first is just if you could comment a little on the Eurasian Economic Union that we read about earlier this year and how your country views that. And as a kind of related question, could you also comment on your country's relations or the development of the relationship between your country and China? Thank you.
Right. The Eurasian Union, I don't know, we're part of the EU. So whatever relations there are with the Eurasian Union, presumably, trade, insofar as trade is concerned, trade in the European Union is strictly trade relations are strictly the province of the Brussels, of the European Commission. So whatever happens, the big difference, of course, between the European Union is that and the Eurasian Union is that countries work long and hard to join the European Union because they want to join the European Union, and countries that don't even want to join the Eurasian Union find themselves in it. So I don't know. There's a big difference. Estonian relations with China. Well, I mean, it's. I mean, they're normal, I would say. I mean, there's. China is not a. Wait. It's such a big market that for us, we couldn't supply anything to them. There are 1,000 Chinese for every single Estonian. So it's a big, but otherwise relations are good. Yeah.
Then I will go to the left, the lady there with a hand up.
Lucy Webster. I come from an organization that supports universal membership in the Security Council through regional representation and the elimination of the veto held by the 5 victors in World War II. This has tended to be viewed as a very long shot concept. On the other hand, when we have a situation such as you have described now, I wonder whether there might be more interest in doing something to make the Security Council less blocked up and less prejudicial to certain governments. Thank you.
Well, I certainly would believe in a single seat for the European Union, but I don't see the UK and France giving up their seats in favor of the European Union. So I don't know how you're going to do it. But I mean, as with every increasing year, the current membership seems more and more kind of as a relic of a completely different world. I mean, it's not 1945, and why I mean, to take the example of Brazil, right? I mean, Brazil is a very different country in 2014 from what it was in 1945, and which leads me to another point which I would make. I mean, I think that one of the things that needs to be done also in the UN is that, especially in light of what I talked before about the sort of the decline in security empathy, is that I think that a lot of countries, I think the BRICS, or at least the BICS, because it should be playing a much greater role in peacekeeping operations. It's kind of odd to see tiny Estonia active virtually everywhere in peacekeeping, and then you see a lot of big countries that are doing nothing. There's an African Union. You know, maybe and Estonia is in Mali and the Central African Republic. I think we need to have a change also in the concept of international responsibility.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Spann. I'm the president of Education and Literacy Fund for Africa. I was wondering if you had ever entertained the thought of uniting with other small countries like your own, like an African Union or something like that, that because there's so many countries, large and small, that are their economies are very fragile now, and they're very vulnerable and susceptible to war now. So now that you know that, have you ever thought about sitting down, planning for the future and helping the future generations and including them, and just starting your own European Union, for example, with smaller countries?
Well, the EU actually has a very active policy towards Africa and has all kinds of programs where we also contribute, as well as through aid. Specifically, a number of African countries have come to Estonia to see how we do e-governance, which is where we're probably one or two in the world. But follow-up has been poor on their part, I would say. I don't know, put that politely, but they want to come, and then nothing really proceeds from that. We have, with the exception of Tunisia, where we actually do have been working quite closely on developing their e-governance. On other issues, because we're so small, we try to do our relations with countries further away through the EU, because we just don't have that many people, nor can we afford all the plane fare. So we go to Brussels.
We have a few minutes left, so I'll take one or two questions more. So if you don't raise your hands, you will not have the opportunity. I see two hands, and you will be given the floor, both of you. First, I go to the right, and then to my left.
Craig Whitney, formerly from the New York Times. Mr. President, you sound very eager to see all your fellow members of NATO make their commitments in spending and increasing NATO's military strength. How seriously do you think some of them, or all of them, NATO as a whole, how seriously is NATO taking this crisis that Putin has caused, and how seriously does Putin take NATO?
That's a very good question, yes. Well, I think it's testing NATO, actually. 20 years ago, there was a piece by the Nebraskan senator, what's his name, wrote, NATO out of area or out of business. And, right, Richard Lugar, and someone else. Indiana. Okay, someone else, another senator. Right, okay. Well, it's like Americans in Europe, me in the Midwest. Just don't know where anything is. And that was the slogan of NATO, and that was under that NATO proceeded to get involved all over the place. I think where we've gotten today is, it's back in area, back in business. That the core task of NATO, which is the territorial defense of its members, people realize that's what we have to deal with. Now, how much different countries want to do that? Well, some want to do it more, some do it less, and it depends on where you are. The Federal Republic of Germany, when it was divided during the 1968 invasion of the erstwhile Czechoslovakia, was very concerned about troop reductions on the part of the United States in Germany, West Germany, and didn't want that to happen. In 2014, in addition to having a peace dividend, they have lots of countries between them and the potential threat. They would not want to see permanent troop stationing in, say, the Baltic countries or Poland. So it depends where you sit. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And that's what we face. There are still 45,000 U.S. troops permanently stationed in Germany, even though it's 800 kilometers to Russia.
Thank you. And then the last question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. My name is Michael Snyder, and I work at IPI in the Center for Peace Operations. You had mentioned that if the security reality continues down this path, that Estonia and other countries may have to reconsider their contributions to UN peacekeeping. I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on that point. Is Estonia considering downgrading its contributions, or would it maybe reorient its contributions towards the EU, NATO, and other countries?
No, there's no policy change. We also continue to be one of the post-communist countries, one of the highest percentage of contributions to foreign aid. No, there is not that, but I just don't see it being sustainable. That's all. I'm not saying Estonia. I'm saying in general. When that's why I sort of talked about the Maslowian hierarchy of needs of states, is that at some point if the situation looks more and more threatening, you will say, well, do we really need that's kind of a nice thing we do, but we have to cut back because we have to worry about our immediate existence, and that's where it's my prediction that if we don't do something about security, that I don't know what'll happen, what my government will do, but I can see a number of countries saying, well, look, we have to reorder our priorities. That's all. And no plans to do anything. We still continue to go. We went this year both to Central Africa, the Central African Republic, and Mali, and so. There are no plans to decrease our contribution.
Thank you very much. And then all which is left for me is to wrap up. And in doing so, I will say thank you to you for having given us such an interesting and I'd say fascinating time, providing us with great learning, sharing with us your experience, and giving us an enormous amount of food for thought. When I was listening to you, both in your speech and in our discussion here, I was thinking about a book written by the renowned philosopher Hannah Arendt, and the book is called Men in Dark Times, and it's actually about women and men who stood up in dark times, in confusing and difficult dark times, projecting clarity, projecting light in darkness, saluting them for taking away the darkness and showing the way out of darkness and difficulties. And she salutes those men and women, and I was thinking about it because I think you are one of those men who can provide clarity and light in times of difficulties and darkness, and I think this is exactly what you've done with us here today. So I would like to thank you profoundly for it, and also to wish you good luck in continuing to shed light in darkness for your country and for us in the global community. Thank you very much. So we give him a big round of applause.